Out of all the powers of the First World War that joined in 1914 and lasted until the very end, Japan is probably the most forgotten. In this video, I will go over Japanese foreign policy at the time, why they joined World War I on the side of the Allies, and what their war aims were. Japan, during the Meiji Restoration, began modernising their nation. This included everything from industrialisation to political and military reforms. Basically, with the help of foreign traders now entering the country, Japan went from this to this. This included the 1889 Constitution, which created the role of a Prime Minister in Japan. Much like what existed in Britain at the time, Japan would adopt many other British cultured traditions, such as driving on the left and their Royal Mail system. This is logical. Japan wanted to be seen as an equal to the other great powers, and for that they needed an empire. Where best to find inspiration than in what was the largest empire of all time that also happened, like them, to be an island nation. This would lead to friendly relations with Britain later and the signing of the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902. This agreement meant if one signatory power was attacked by a foreign power, the other signatory power must remain neutral, but if one signatory power was invaded by two foreign powers, then the other signatory power must join in defence of their ally. For Japan, this near enough secured peace with Britain, but primarily meant that two powers will never dare to unite against the Japanese Empire if war was to be declared. It would be done by only one nation at a time, which the Japanese, through the Russo-Japanese War, believed they could handle. Japanese imperialism began with the invasion of the Ryukyu Islands. This was followed by an invasion of Korea, a puppet of the Qing dynasty at the time. Due to their modernisation, industrialised army, Japan won what would become known as the First Sino-Japanese War, and gained Taiwan out of the peace talks. What followed was the Boxer Rebellion in China, where many European nations sent troops to get involved in the Civil War. Russia, to protect their new Trans-Siberian Railway connection that led through Manchuria to Port Arthur, sent a heavy amount of troops into the region. Because Japan claimed this region as their own, and it also bordered their territory, Korea, this was seen as worrying to them. The two were unable to come to an agreement. After Russia provoked them, Japan declared war, destroying the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, and after several more Japanese victories and Russian revolts back home, Russia pushed for peace. The Peace of Portsmouth of 1905 goes as follows. The lease to Port Arthur was granted to Japan, along with access to the South Manchurian Railway and their mining concessions. Korea was recognised as being under the control of Japan. Russian forces had to pull out of the Manchuria region, and other commercial trade agreements, naval passage agreements, and fishing rights, as usual. The two powers were struggling on a few points, however. The island of Sakhalin both desired, and so they could not come to an agreement. Eventually, US President Theodore Roosevelt stepped in and proposed they divide it between a north and south line. Reparations were also sought after by Japan, but Russia would not budge on that front, and so Japan dropped it and pushed instead for peace. But then, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Europe soon found itself at war. It was Britain who declared war on Germany on the 4th of August, and then on Austria-Hungary on the 12th of August. As Britain declared the war, Japan had no legal obligation to get involved through the Anglo-Japanese Alliance. However, it did mean that they could not join the Central Powers. Although, as discussed, Japan wanted to be seen and valued alongside the other major European powers, and the best way to do that would be through joining the war. In addition, Britain reached out to Japan for help, wanting to end German shipping routes in the Pacific, In return, Germany held many islands in the region that Japan wanted their hands on, but still this was not enough to drag them into the war that easily. Japan, on the 15th of August, sent an ultimatum to Germany. It goes as follows: Germany must at once withdraw from Japanese and Chinese waters in the Pacific, and any ships that could not pull out must be disarmed. Finally, Germany must surrender their lease over the Chinese Kaiakshu port back to China. They had until noon on the 23rd of August to accept, or Japan will take the action it deemed necessary. Germany refused, and so Japan declared war on Germany on the 23rd, and again on Austria-Hungary on the 25th of August. This ultimatum intentionally had demands that the receiver could not possibly accept, and was just used as an excuse to trigger a war. I wonder where they got that idea from. Between the years of 1915 and 1916, Germany would attempt to sign a separate peace with Japan, but Japan was not interested in the offers. Instead, they signed an agreement with Russia, settling disputes in China, and agreeing not to sign separate peace treaties. What I usually like to do at this point is conduct a thought experiment. I usually ask what would happen if the power in question obliterated all enemies and became the most dominant member at the table. What would they want for themselves in the perfect case scenario, to get a better idea of their war aims? However, I won't do that for Japan. The Japanese were adamant not to get involved in the slow stalemate of trench warfare. What Japan wanted was to focus on the Pacific, which they did well in our timeline anyway. Their fleets did help elsewhere, even as far as the Mediterranean, and their troops even helped with the evacuation of the Czech Legion from Bolshevik-occupied Russia. The issue is, Japan simply was not interested in anything they could have gained out of the Ottomans or Austro-Hungarians, and when it came to Germany, their only real goal was to occupy the Pacific Islands and kick them out of China. And so that is what they focused on, and that is, for the most part, what they got, although they certainly wanted more. This is how it looked pre-war, and this is how it looked post-war. In the perfect scenario, Japan would have taken all German territories in the Pacific for themselves. However, there was something else on their mind. Their proposal to the League of Nations was that the other great powers of the world must recognise Japan as a great power, and Japan must be treated equally in every respect. This was declined, primarily by Britain, who feared if they accepted this for the Japanese, then the people in their own empire may rise up expecting the same treatment. Equally, if Japan did have the perfect scenario, took Berlin, wiped out the Ottomans and all that, to hold the greatest seat at the table, the same issue would persist. No matter their achievements at the time, the Japanese would be seen as less, limiting their potential at the negotiations table. It was this turndown that many historians mark as the start of Japan's step away from the Europeans, and towards a policy focusing on themselves and their own empire building. Despite this, however, they made some gains during the war, which I think are interesting. First of all, the Allied powers needed more and more resources as the war progressed, resources Japan was willing to export. Japan went from a debtor state to a creditor state, quadrupling exports, although this resulted in inflation and only lasted for the length that the war was fought. Still, it further pushed Japan into becoming a wealthy, industrialised empire. And secondly, in China, while the rest of the world was focusing on Europe, Japan saw the opportunity to press their 21 demands to the Chinese government. In effect, this would have made China a protectorate to Japan, but this attempt received global condemnation, especially from the United States, and so Japan backed down. This mounting pressure from Japan was a major reason why China joined the Entente and declared war on Germany in 1917. If China was not involved, then there was risk the German Chinese ports could have been handed over to Japan, which would have posed a greater threat. In addition, Japan would have been less likely to attack a power they were now allied with. In the end, the Shantung province was granted to Japan temporarily, which they did return in 1922. Despite this, however, the Chinese nationalists were outraged and turned against the foreign imperial powers. 1 year later, those Chinese nationalists would found the Chinese Communist Party. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance fell apart in 1921. Many officials in America expected a war someday with the Japanese Empire. In addition, cooperation between the two allies meant they would both be dominant over Pacific trade, which would hurt the trading power of China and America. It was made clear that the British had to choose. If they kept Japan, there was risk that it could snowball into a war against the US, which they did not want. And so, Japan, after the war, found itself isolated from the world once more. Hope you enjoyed and learnt something. Leave a like if you did, subscribe for more, and please share with anyone else you think may be interested. This has been the history of diplomacy.